Tonight, I want to focus on the people who were involved in Yeshua's death, because there's certain questions that come up about them, and I think we need to take a look at what's known about them. An interesting thing now, as we look at Luke 23, 50 through 53, we have what the book of Luke has to say about Joseph of Arimathea. And what's interesting about this is that in all four of these gospel accounts about the death of Yeshua, it tells us about Joseph of Arimathea. And it's almost breathtaking when we see this man and we see what he did and his tremendous courage and how he took charge of the whole thing. And when you read these verses, then you're thinking, oh, wow, I want to find out more about Joseph of Arimathea. So you're looking for other verses in the Bible that'll tell you more about who he is and what he did. And then when you do that, it can be very disappointing because you find out the only place in all the scriptures that you find anything about him is in these four parallel accounts regarding the death of Yeshua. There's not another word about him. And that is just very unusual when you really think about what was going on. So here it gives us a general picture of Joseph. Doesn't tell us much. In fact, none of these accounts tell us much. But he is called a member of the council. We're told that he's a good and righteous man who did not agree with the council indeed of finding Yeshua guilty. In fact, he didn't consent to it. Now that's amazing. You just think about this. Look at how intent the Sanhedrin was on this special secret trial and putting together false witnesses, everything they did. Can you imagine what it must have been like for one of those councilmen to not consent? So that's a pretty amazing thing that he did. It says he was waiting for the kingdom of Elohim, and he went and asked Pilate for Yeshua's body. And then it says he took it down and wrapped it and laid him in the tomb and so on. So it gives Joseph complete credit for everything having to do with the burial of Yeshua. This accords well with the other Gospels. They each have a little different emphasis, being a little different witness in each case. For instance, in Matthew, it adds that he was a rich man and that he was Yeshua's disciple. And it tells us there that he laid him in his own new tomb. And so those are all interesting facts. In Mark, it adds that he was a prominent council member. So this might explain how he could withhold his consent and yet feel that he was not jeopardizing himself, because apparently he had position even above some of the other council members. Again, it says he was looking for the kingdom of Elohim. When it tells us about him going before Pilate to claim Yeshua's body, it says he boldly went into Pilate. So again, this really speaks of authority, of this man's authority. I think here in Mark, it's really emphasizing Joseph's authority, being a prominent council member, going in boldly to Pilate. And again, it tells us about the details of preparing the body and the burial. And then in John, which we'll get to eventually, it tells us that he was a disciple of Yeshua, but secretly for fear of the Judeans. Now, frankly, that doesn't seem to add up for me very well with the other accounts, which seem to portray Joseph as a very courageous figure. And I'm not saying that what John is saying isn't true. I'm just saying there must be some other explanation for why John is emphasizing this secrecy. Perhaps, since the book of John was written much later than the other Gospels, there was some reason to portray Joseph as being a secret disciple. Maybe this was an explanation for why there wasn't more information about him out there, or why nobody apparently had seen him in quite a while. Well, here's a summary of these facts from these various accounts. Joseph was from Arimathea. He was a rich man. He was a prominent council member. He had not consented to their counsel indeed. He was waiting for the kingdom of Elohim. He was a disciple of Yeshua, secretly for fear of the Judeans. He boldly went into Pilate for Yeshua's body. And obviously directing others, he took it down, prepared the body, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid him in his own new tomb, and rolled a great stone in front of the door. So this is kind of amazing, because it's like Joseph just shows up and takes over. So it kind of leaves some questions. And why would a man of this obvious importance in Yeshua's life never be written about before or after this event? Well, we can't find the answers to these questions in the scriptures, because as I noted, they don't really talk about him again. And so to get any information, we really have to go to extra biblical claims and legends about Joseph of Arimathea. Now, before I do this, I want to draw a clear line here, because as you know, I try to stick very closely to the scriptures and provable related information. Having said that, in this case, I want you to understand we're moving now from that realm into the realm of what we can prove historically, as well as some various legends and speculations. So I'm wanting you to understand, I'm not claiming that everything we're going into here is verifiable truth, because it really isn't. But nevertheless, the overall picture, I feel, helps to illuminate what really happened with Joseph and the others who were involved in the burial of Yeshua. So we're going to look at this at historical and legendary information starting now. And I got to tell you, this is about as far out as I get, because we're talking about some things that clearly many people will see as crazy. And yet, they involve this man, and this is the only portion of Scripture where he's mentioned. So if you want to know anything else about him, it's going to take you into these kind of claims. There's a lot of traditional information that agrees that he was Mary's uncle, that is, Mary, the mother of Yeshua, and thus Yeshua's great uncle. And this would explain his position in the family. We'll get into more of that later. It's claimed that he was a merchant who visited England to buy Cornish tin. Now, the first time I ever heard this, it made my head fall off. I mean, it just sounds so crazy, doesn't it? But for you and for this meeting, I took some time to look into this, and I'm going to share my results with you. Not only that, but the legends say that he took Yeshua with him as a teen to England. I told you, we're going to get pretty far out. The legends say he was the first person to bring the gospel to Britain, and that he built Britain's first church. That is, no doubt, meaning an assembly. And in the Arthurian legends, it said that he brought to England the cup containing the blood of Yeshua, known as the Holy Grail. Are we going to talk about the Holy Grail? Yes, we really are. So strap in your seatbelt, okay? So the first question that we have about this is, could any of this be true? And if you're like me, you're just shaking your head no. I mean, that's where I was in looking at this. And you know, all of us for years have heard stuff like this. We've heard about the Arthurian legends and the Holy Grail. And, you know, most of us never even give that a thought because it just all sounds so crazy. And yet, you know what? Sometimes behind the legends about things, there can be nuggets of truth that are then embellished and basically become almost unrecognizable. But if you dig back the layers, you peel away the layers, and you can find some things that actually might be true. So we are going to go on a hunting expedition. I am telling you that right now. Full disclosure, but I think you'll find it interesting. So first, we have Joseph of Arimathea being Mary's uncle. And this persistent claim agrees with the tradition that the senior male relative of a crucified person was required to deal with the body. Now, you've already seen tonight from Steve's excellent presentation that the Torah required the body to be taken down before the end of the day. There was not a lot of time for that to happen. And as you read about what happened with Joseph, it's very clear he and the women were all ready to go, right? And he was the one clearly who was in charge. So he is the one that organized all of this. And most of the other women that helped him, they were all his relatives. We'll get into that too a little later. Now, this does make sense too, because Yeshua's stepfather, Joseph, was already dead. We don't find mention of him as we go through the Gospels at any time during Yeshua's ministry, but we do find mention of Mary and his brothers and sisters. So it's pretty clear that Mary's husband, Joseph, was gone. And so there had to be someone else to step up. And, you know, both in Hebrew custom, and some would say even scripture, as well as the requirement of the Romans, the patriarch of the family was the one that had to take charge. So the idea that Joseph was the surviving patriarch of the family and Mary's uncle is not stupid. It really is a pretty good suggestion and definitely could be true. And this would also explain a lot of his conduct. The fact that he could very boldly go into Pilate to demand the body, his legal right to do it. This would explain why he's giving the orders to the women, because as the patriarch of the family, he's giving the direction, the headship in order to accomplish this. So this particular legend tracks pretty closely with the facts. And absent some other explanation, I think it stands for the time being. Well, here we get to the more controversial material. He was a merchant who visited England to buy Cornish tin. And that certainly seems strange the first time I heard it. Is it even possible that a Judean could travel as far away as England to trade in metals? And why tin? Why not something more exotic like silver or gold? Something like that. Tin? Well, I did some study on this to see if this was even feasible. And here's the things that I found out. Tin was vital to the ancient world. And as a matter of fact, just like today, oil and electricity are absolutely vital to civilization. Well, for most of history, tin was absolutely vital to civilization. Now you might be thinking, tin? I never heard of tin. Well, you might have not heard of tin in history, but you have heard of bronze. Did you ever hear of the Bronze Age? Well, to make bronze, you need tin, because tin is mixed with copper to make bronze. So there could be no Bronze Age civilization without tin. And you know, when the Iron Age started, they didn't stop using bronze. They continued to need it for a lot of things. So this was interesting to find this out, that tin was really a very important and vital commodity. So they needed it everywhere, in every civilized place. This kind of shocked me. This is an actual tin ingot that was found at a shipwreck near Israel. There was English tin in Israel as early as 3300 BC. That's right. There was a shipwreck discovered near Haifa of present-day Israel. There were numerous tin ingots that were recovered, and the chemical makeup is most like the tin that is found in Cornwall, England. I thought that was interesting. So that is over 5,000 years ago. They were trading in tin in Israel. Here is a map showing the influence of the ancient Romans, the areas in which there was Roman influence. And all the way near the bottom right, we find Judea. Of course, that's where Joseph of Arimathea lived. And all the way up near the top left, we find Britannia. And that's where the Cornish tin mines were located. But notice that they're all within the sphere of the ancient Roman civilization. So that means even though Britain was about as far away as the known world in those days, that people in Judea certainly knew about Britain, and it was within the sphere of trade of the Roman Empire. So this makes the idea more possible, because obviously somebody was trading in tin, right? So it certainly could have been Joseph of Arimathea. Well, then I thought maybe the Romans were dominating Britain, and it really would have been impossible for Judeans to be able to trade with Britain. So I looked up the history, and what I found is that between 54 BC and 43 AD is this long time of peace with the Romans, between Britain and the Romans. And during this time, Britain was affected by the Roman economic and cultural influences. It's a lot like the United States is in much of the world today, where our culture is kind of appropriated by various countries where we trade. And this had happened in Britannia. So there they no doubt were familiar with the common language of the Romans. Usually that was Greek, and that was spoken in Judea too. It was spoken all over the Roman Empire. And in the southern part of Britannia, that's where the tin mines were located, and this was especially friendly to the Romans. So, total green light there for Joseph of Arimathea. He certainly could have been trading in that area during this time period that we're talking about. Now we're going to talk a little bit about Cornwall and that whole area where the tin is located. And this particular information is from the University of Exeter, which is a university there in that area. And on the map, you see basically the area that we're talking about. And this is the area where the tin has been mined. And you see an artifact there, an ancient artifact that was found of bronze that was alloyed with tin. And it mentions that the ore that is mined there has been exploited from the Bronze Age forward. And it was only in the last century that these mines finally went out of use. So this really accords well with all the other information that we have about this. Now here's something else I found out that is very interesting. And this is from an online museum about the mines and about the area. And they asked a question: you may wonder why Cornwall had the mineral mines that the rest of Britain missed out on. You see, the truth is, it was only in Cornwall that these tin mines and other minerals could be found. Just this one place. So, if Joseph or anybody else was trading with England, this had to be where the tin was coming from. Cornwall had to be the place. And it mentions the geological reasons why this is, but one of the unusual things about the mining of tin and these other metals there in that place is that because of the way the rocks are formed, you can't have mines like we normally think of them, where they dig a mine horizontally and you can just keep going in and keep digging, have lots and lots of people in there. The way these mines were is each fissure had to be mined straight down and needed a separate mine. Now, this was great for ancient miners because let's say you were someone who was an enterprising person and you wanted to make your fortune. You could go to this place, and because these mines really could not be mined by a crowd of people, you could find one of these, because this was still pretty early, one of these places where there's tin, and make your own little mine right there. Dig out a bunch of tin, and since it was so necessary all over the empire, it's not going to be hard for you to sell that tin. So this was a place, I think, how I envision this really is the sort of place where you could have a lot of freedom. Because where people can develop their own wealth like this, normally you have a place where there's a lot of freedom. And that's just an observation of my own about it. But I think it is very interesting information. Well, here's some more. By the way, the picture is an actual picture of the coastline in the area where these mines were. This is kind of mind-blowing, really. The Phoenicians were the first from the east to connect up with this tin in the Bronze Age, okay? I mean, this was like way back. But through connection with the Phoenicians, we've talked about them before too, enterprising Jews worked the Cornish mines from ancient times. Now, isn't this interesting? According to reliable sources, the oldest pits containing smelted tin are called Jews' houses, upholding the tradition that the tin mines of Cornwall were wrought by the Jews. And the artifacts are found sometimes in the ancient rubble. And in the area, the term Jews' houses, Jews' tin, Jews' leavings are commonly found. And these prove the connection of these strangers with the Cornish miners. I thought that was pretty interesting. Of course, you know, in the first century, there were Jewish communities all over the Roman Empire. And why wouldn't some of those enterprising Jewish people decide to locate in this place in Cornwall where they could mine this tin out of the ground? Makes a lot of sense. And if it was the kind of a more free place that I think of it as, where people coming from different places to be involved in the mining and the trade, it would be a place where they could be pretty much unhindered in their mining efforts there. So I thought that was really interesting. So if Joseph of Arimathea did trade in tin, it had to be in the area of Cornwall. And we see there's evidence of a strong Jewish presence in the tin mines in Cornwall. So also, at the same time, we see that Britain was in a good relationship with Rome at the time, was not under Roman domination, was trading with the Roman Empire. There was no impediment to trade with the Cornwall tin. So it's not hard to envision Joseph having connections with other Jews working the tin mines of Cornwall, getting rich through the importation of tin mined by them into Judea. Can't you just see that, right? It's so easy to figure that out. If you've got Jews in Cornwall that are mining the tin, you will absolutely have Jews in Judea that are trading with them. So somebody was trading with the Jews in Cornwall in tin. And it certainly could have been Joseph of Arimathea, especially since there are a lot of traditions saying that he did. So also, it would give him status with the Romans. You know how it works? You know politics, right? You know how it works. Here, for instance, in the United States, nobody cares too much about the voters. They do care about the people with money. And that's pretty much always been true with politicians and political powers. So this would tell you why Joseph was seen as kind of a guy to keep your hands off in the time of Yeshua. And also with his wealth, this would be an added reason why he would have easy access to Pilate. So there's really a lot about the story that adds up. And I was surprised, really, as I looked into it. But, you know, 2 and 2 is 4. And all the facts that would allow for this to happen seem to be there. Now we're going to look at the Cornish traditions of Joseph of Arimathea. You know, if he was there, you'd expect there to be some kind of trace. You wouldn't expect a lot because, after all, it was 2,000 years ago, right? but you'd expect some kind of trace. And there are local traditions of Joseph having visited Cornwall in the course of his mining business. These include poems and miners' songs in the area that have been passed down through the generations. One of them has a line, Joseph was a tin man. Joseph was in the tin trade. And similar lines show up in these miner songs. There's a travel guide of the area. This is a guide to Penzance, Land's End, and Skilly, which is exactly the area where he traded. And it states, there is a traditional story that Joseph of Arimathea was connected with Tsiyon. I find that an interesting name. And this is located near Penzance on this map. When he and other Jews traded with the ancient tin miners of Cornwall. So this is just stated as a fact in the travel guide. This is very common there in the area. People generally do believe this there in the area, and there's a lot of traditional material that they put out. Here's an interesting book. This is a similar kind of book, really. It's called the Book of Cornwall, and this has a lot of information about the local area and from the local area. And many Cornish traditions abound of Joseph of Arimathea visiting various places in Cornwall with his young nephew, Jesus. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? And many of these ancient traditions and legends are found in this Book of Cornwall. And from the Book of Cornwall, we have this quote kind of summing up some of this. Another Cornish story is to the effect that Joseph of Arimathea came in a boat to Cornwall and brought the boy Jesus with him, and the latter taught him how to extract tin and purge it from its wolfram. This is some other element. When the tin is flashed, then the tinner shouts, Joseph was in the trade. So it's kind of interesting. And, this could very readily be an embellishment. Like if Joseph of Arimathea had been there, it probably wouldn't take too long for people to say that his nephew was there with him. So it's not necessarily true that actually happened. But on the other hand, how do we know it didn't? Because when he was a teenager, wouldn't this be a great experience for him with his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, to go on a sea voyage and to visit distant places? I bet you all of my kids would love to do that. I know I would have when I was a teenager. So it's an interesting legend, isn't it? Now we get to Arimathea itself, and this is probably identical with Ramah, the birthplace of Samuel the prophet. And I just found it interesting after finding all of this other information that Arimathea is located roughly halfway between Jerusalem and the port city of Joppa. And if Joseph is a rich merchant who obviously is dealing with the port, and he's also a prominent council member where he needs to go to Jerusalem often and is involved there in the council meetings, where would you want to live? If I was going to pick a location, it would be kind of in the middle of those 2 points. And this way, he's less than 20 miles from both locations. So, in a way, his location, to me, even agrees somewhat with these stories. The truth is, I was looking for something in the facts to say that this couldn't be true. And as far as him being a merchant with England, I found out it's entirely possible that he could have been. entirely possible. You can't find any negative idea that could be refuted about it. And there's really so many traditions that he actually was, that the more you look into that aspect, the less skeptical you feel. At least that was my effect. Well, then we have some other claims that he was the first person to bring the gospel to Britain, that he built Britain's first church, that he brought to England the cup containing the blood of Yeshua, known as the Holy Grail. So we get farther out with each point, don't we? Well, let's take a look at some of this. Here we have a work in Latin by Caesar Baronius, his Ecclesiastical Annals. And this is a history of the church as envisioned by this church historian. And Wikipedia has a part on him, and it says, Italian cardinal and ecclesiastical historian of the Roman Catholic Church. In the Annals, he treats history in strict chronological order and keeps theology in the background. Lord Acton called it the greatest history of the church ever written. So this is not the sort of thing that you can just easily dismiss, because you're not going to find a history that's, going to be better than this, unless you find something from that era that you can verify. So, and also at that time, they were a lot closer to those ancient times than we are today. And very likely had, especially this man who was a church historian, had access to materials and to various documentation that we don't have today. And so I thought he was an interesting person to look to. And he is said to have discovered a document of great antiquity in the Vatican archives to which he had access. And in the manuscript he found, he states that about 35 AD, this would be about 2 years after Yeshua died and was raised, Joseph of Arimathea and some others, including Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, Martha, and unnamed others, possibly including Mary, mother of Yeshua, were set adrift together in a boat without sails or oars from the coast of Judea under Jewish persecution. Now, you can give or take a year or two on this, and it still makes a lot of sense, because in the book of Acts, we read about the persecution of Stephen that broke out in the time of Stephen, and it was very early. So it could have been around this time, around 35 AD, in which case it tells us there that persecution was falling upon the believers. And what this says actually happened to Joseph of Arimathea and this group with him is that they were set into a boat. It doesn't tell us how large the boat was, and set adrift on the waters without any oars or sails. Now, this to me at first sounds kind of strange. Why, if they wanted to do that, didn't they just execute these people? But then I'm thinking, well, wait a minute here. Joseph of Arimathea apparently was a very influential person. Maybe if you wanted to get rid of somebody, you wouldn't just kill them where you could get into trouble. You might just want to get rid of them. So why not just put all these troublesome people on a boat without sails or oars and set them out to sea? And then it's not your fault when they die. And besides that, nobody will know. So it's not a totally stupid idea that this might have happened. In another book from the Middle Ages, another historian writes about the ancient church of Les Saintes Marias. Now, I'm probably not saying that right because it's French, and I'm not. Here's what it says. There are, on the seacoast, one sees the first of continental churches, which was founded in honor of the most blessed mother of our Lord, and consecrated by many of the 72 disciples who were driven from Judea and exposed to the sea in an oarless boat. Maximin of Acts, Lazarus, yes, that Lazarus, the brother of Martha and Mary, and several other people that he mentions here, including Martha, Mary Magdalene, and others. It just has and others. I'm thinking this was a big boat. This is probably not just a small boat. Maybe this was one of Joseph's own merchant boats that they did this with. But the point is, you have a separate historian here who's making mention of the same event, and he is adding here where this boat landed, where it ended up. And I did a little more research on this, looking in the area that it mentioned. And I found there a travel site called Travel France Online that has history of the various places. And it talks about this place. It mentions the three Marys there in that place I can't pronounce, and located on the shore, the same shore mentioned by the historian. It says it was indeed the place where Mary Jacobi, that is Mary, wife of Clopas, Joseph's brother, Mary Salome, that is wife of Zebedee, mother of James and John, sister of Mary, the Lord's mother, and Mary Magdalene landed upon their flight from Palestine. The three Marys escaped persecution to which Christians were subject in the Holy Land, however, were forced into exile. The Romans sent them away on a makeshift raft that drifted across the Mediterranean. So the boat turned into a raft here, as facts sometimes change somewhat, but the basic story still seems to be intact. It says it eventually ran aground on the shore of Camargue in a place known as Radis in Gaelic. The place became known as Notre Dame de la Barque. I'm sure I'm messing that up. And then it was changed to its present name. And then it says the Christian tradition has it that the three Marys landed with several companions. Among them were Martha, Lazarus, Maximin of Bethany, Sidonius, and Joseph of Arimathea, the bearer of the Holy Grail. So that's the first time looking at actual histories and related information that I came across the Holy Grail. Joseph of Arimathea, the bearer of the Holy Grail. I thought that was pretty interesting. So it's not hard to believe the story about the boat because it seems to go together with the biblical information about the persecution at that time where all the believers were fleeing. And there are other traditions, legends, and historical information about these figures ending up in France. So all of that seems interesting and possible. But the Holy Grail thing got my attention here, and so I decided to look at that a little bit more. Here we have a picture of the knight Percival on a quest to find the Holy Grail. And apparently he's getting some divine information in the picture. Here in Wikipedia, talking about all this, it says the word Grail, as it is earliest spelled, comes from Old French Grail or Grial, meaning a cup or bowl of earth, wood, or metal. So now you know what Grail means. Interestingly, there's a story called Joseph de Arimathea, about Joseph of Arimathea. and it was composed in the Middle Ages by Robert D. Boron. It tells the story of Joseph of Arimathea acquiring the chalice of the Last Supper to collect Christ's blood upon his removal from the cross. Joseph is thrown in prison where Christ visits him and explains the mysteries of the blessed cup. Upon his release, Joseph gathers his in-laws and other followers and travels to the west. He founds a dynasty of Grail keepers that eventually include Percival. Well, I see this as more or less going along with the idea of Joseph of Arimathea and the other group ending up in the west, in Gaul, and, of course, moving from there to Britain. If Joseph of Arimathea already had interests and friends in Britain, even if the others stayed in Gaul, which there seems to be some evidence they did, all he had to do is travel a short distance overland till he got to the English Channel, and then from there, very easily, could get back to the whole area we've been talking about in Cornwall. So that could easily have happened. About collecting the blood with the cup, I just have to tell you, I just don't see that happening. But I have to admit, it could have happened, because if anybody could have done this, it would have been Joseph, because he had control of the body. And it was a bloody mess. So certainly there was plenty of blood to be had if he had chosen to save it. But the truth is, I think that mental attitude is more from the Middle Ages than it is from the first century. I doubt that people at that time would have looked at things in that way to be collecting relics. You know, there's certain things you might want to keep the memory of somebody important to you, but probably their blood is not among those things. So, you know, right away, I kind of discredit that. And yet, it seems to me there might be something to this about the Holy Grail, that maybe it means something. And especially the idea that Joseph of Arimathea founded a dynasty of Grail keepers. It's almost saying like he had some kind of special mission there in England. And that makes me wonder if that could be true. Well, here's another place that is of interest. You've probably heard of Glastonbury Abbey. There are so many legends about this place and a lot of crazy people. Some people say the Knights Templars were buried there and were headquartered there. There's legends of King Arthur that revolve around this. And yet, Glastonbury Abbey is located in the area of these tin mines. The picture kind of shows you that. This is, by the way, what it's showing there is the county of Somerset, which is, of course, probably not exactly the ancient Somerset, but pretty close. So it shows you the area there. It says Glastonbury Abbey was a monastery in Glastonbury, Somerset, England. The abbey was founded in the 4th century and enlarged in the 10th. So clearly, since the abbey was founded in the 4th century, it wasn't there in the 1st century when Joseph of Arimathea would have been there if he was there. From at least the 12th century, the Glastonbury area has been associated with the legend of King Arthur and Avalon. Christian legends have claimed that the abbey was founded by Joseph of Arimathea in the 1st century. So if he founded it in the 1st century, but it's built in the 4th century, leaves some questions, doesn't it? This is a picture of what is purported to be King Arthur's tomb in Glastonbury Abbey. And some people say it's real, some people say it's fake. Here's what the abbey basically says about it. A contemporaneous account was given by Cambrensis, according to which the abbot commissioned a search discovering at the depth of 16 feet a massive hollowed oak tree containing 2 skeletons. Under the covering stone was a leaden cross with the specific inscription, "Here lies interred the famous King Arthur on the Isle of Avalon." So that's interesting. Of course, there's lots of people that say this is fake, but there's others that say this is historical information. This was in fact found. So I'm just reporting to you what I found here. So where did this Holy Grail story come from? Here's what it says in Wikipedia about it. Scholars have long speculated on the origins of the Holy Grail. Joseph Goering has identified sources for Grail imagery in 12th century wall painting from churches in the Pyrenees. And these paintings are iconic images of the Virgin Mary holding a bowl that radiates tongues of fire. Images that predate the first literary account. Now, I found this interesting because I'm thinking what Mary's going to be holding if she's holding the Grail is a cup full of the blood of Jesus, right? But instead, it's radiating tongues of fire. So that's really interesting to me. It's as if in this imagery, this cup is really the source of authority, some kind of authority with this fire or lightning radiating out of it. And this particular scholar is saying that it's these pictures that are really the source of the Grail legend. Well, on the map that you see behind this quote, I've outlined the area where the historians say that Joseph of Arimathea and the others landed. And with the others, what I'm showing you is the Pyrenees Mountains. And these are located on the border of France. And it's interesting to me that these churches that have these ancient images of the Grail are located really so close to this place where Joseph of Arimathea and the others were supposed to have landed. And it turns out there's all kinds of churches and stuff around the area going back to very ancient times that commemorate all these people and claim that they were there. And there are actually these pictures there where the Grail legend seems to have originated in the form of a cup in the hand of Mary, the mother of Yeshua. It's just an interesting thing. It speaks to me of something that if you peeled away some of the layers, there's probably some truth to this. And it makes you wonder, okay, what really is the truth to this Grail legend? Well, we have some more that we've learned about it. The guy on the stained glass window is William of Malmesbury. And actually, he had a Latin name. I won't pronounce that either. And he was the foremost English historian of the 12th century. So, again, he's as reputable a source as you could find for that time period. And he is called a gifted historical scholar. And I'm bringing him up because he wrote about these very issues I'm talking about. And he has extensive histories regarding England, the kings of England, the church in England, and so on. And he wrote this: 12 holy missionaries with Joseph of Arimathea at their head came over to Britain, preaching the incarnation of Jesus Christ. the king, at their petition, gave them for their habitation a certain island bordering on this region, covered with trees and bramble bushes and surrounded by marshes, called, I have no idea how to pronounce that. Speaking from the writings of the ancients, which he found at Glastonbury Abbey. So he is saying that Joseph of Arimathea had 12 missionaries with him, of which he was the leader, and asked the king for some land for their group. That seems to me a pretty bold thing to do. And the king gave it to them. He gave it to them. He gave them an island that bordered on this region. Bordered on means in a close area, not this particular area. And you notice when we looked at Somerset and the Abbey, it's located right next to Cornwall. It's kind of interesting. And it says it's a wet area, essentially. And this was found at Glastonbury Abbey, some ancient record there. Here's the place mentioned, and it's later called the Isle of Avalon. Confirmation of this royal land grant spoken of by William of Malmesbury is found in the Domesday Book, the official registry of Britain. Now, if you happen to be of any kind of British ancestry and you do a study of your surname, of your family name, eventually you'll trace it back to the Domesday Book. Because this is when the king ordered basically this registration of everybody. And so the Domesday Book is used by everybody that does any kind of genealogies, looks into history, and so on. And it's as official a document about this as you can find. And it says the Domus Dei in the great monastery of Glastonbury called the Secret of the Lord. The Secret of the Lord. This Glastonbury church possesses in its own villa 12 hides of land which has never paid tax. This seems to accord with this special land grant that was given to Joseph of Arimathea in this group in that very area. It says, this notable act of the king gave the recipients many British concessions, including the right of citizenship with its privileges of freedom to pass unmolested from one district to another in time of war. The grant was given to them as Judean refugees. So they had this area set apart to them that apparently was a little island. This is the sort of place historians say that they would have lived. This is a typical wattle and daub house. They still make these today, by the way, in a lot of primitive areas. I have been in houses like this. And at Avalon, after receiving perpetual title to the land from the king, Joseph and the 12 settled in. The Abbey records quoted by William of Malmesbury say, these holy men built a chapel of the form that had been shown them. The walls were of osiers wattled together. In other words, it was like this picture. Doesn't look anything like a church to me. It does look like the places, though, that I saw people meeting in when I was in tribal Africa. And so I could imagine that sort of thing. a former director of the excavations at Glastonbury Abbey, a member of the Somerset Archaeological Society, has done work in this area. And he determined that the original meeting place constructed by Joseph and his 12, which is later called a church, was a large circular wattled hut, 25 feet in diameter, with smaller but similar huts of Joseph and his 12 in a circle around the central meeting place. So I did a little diagram for you there. And I just wonder if that arrangement could have influenced the stories about Arthur and the Round Table. And what about the fact that Joseph has 12 companions? That's very suggestive to anybody who's interested in anything Hebrew of government, isn't it? Particularly Hebrew government. So we wonder, was the Avalon settlement immortalized as the Camelot of Arthurian legend and the later site of the church called Glastonbury Abbey? This archaeological excavation that has been done at the site seems to imply that this is the case. So we have a medieval picture of the Holy Grail here, and it's appearing to Arthur and his knights of the Round Table in the picture. This is from a middle-aged book about the myth. The Arthurian legends could all be a myth, as many skeptics say. Surely they could. It's pretty hard to believe that King Arthur, a mythical figure, is connected in any way with Joseph of Arimathea, a biblical figure. And yet, we have verified historical information showing a vital tin trade between England and Judea in the target time frame. We've seen also that this could have happened in terms of peace with Rome. And we've only scratched the surface on all of the history and legendary information about this. Obviously, you could study this for years and you would keep finding more information. And I don't have that much time because I'm going through the whole scriptures with you. So I'm doing what I can, okay? There's a lot more about this that links Joseph and his companions to France and to England, and then finally to a land grant in Avalon, which does, the very name connects directly to the legend of King Arthur. So the legend really could connect in some way to the group of Joseph of Arimathea in Avalon. So what about the Holy Grail itself? Could it be a symbol for some long-forgotten secret of Joseph and his 12? Well, we have a little more information. Salome, Mary Salome, was counted as one of the 3 Marys who were daughters of St. Anne, so making her the sister of Mary, mother of Jesus. Now, this is interesting. We have these 3 Marys who are called the 3 Marys, and they are all sisters. I think that's interesting. They're all sisters. And Anne was their mother. So in some of the stories, we have the 3 Marys landing in Marseille, in France, and they count Mary Magdalene as one of the 3 Marys, and they leave out Mary, the mother of Yeshua. Yet the term the 3 Marys includes these 3 sisters. So I'm wondering, maybe at the time when they recorded this, they didn't want to say where Mary, the mother of Yeshua, was. So they substituted Mary Magdalene to be one of the Marys. I don't know what happened. What I think is that Mary Magdalene was there, and others, if indeed this happened. But when we look at this, the big thing that stands out with these three Marys is that they're all part of the same family that were of the house of David. And in this scenario, Joseph of Arimathea was their uncle. And so he also was of the house of David, and very well may have been the senior patriarch of that entire family, which would go along pretty well with the story that we have looked at in the gospel. It's very possible. So what happened in England could have really been something that relates to the house of David. I mean, after all, just think about what's happening here. Joseph of Arimathea is taking his three nieces, who are also of the house of David, and all were involved in the burial too, away to a distant place. And then after that, we don't specifically have any record of where they were. This would suggest that Joseph was likely the patriarchal head of the house of David at the time of the death of Yeshua. Why did James lead the assembly in Jerusalem and not Joseph? Right? Because Joseph was older than James. If he was the patriarchal head of the family, wouldn't he be the one that would lead the house of David in Jerusalem? Instead, we have James. And speculation, yes, but could it be the reason for this is because the Lord had a different quest for Joseph of Arimathea, a different mission for him? And as senior patriarch of the family, didn't it fall to him to look after the long-term survival and interests of the Davidic dynasty? In other material, I've put out quite a bit of material. What it shows is that this is an obligation of the members of the house of David, and especially would fall upon the patriarch of the family, to ensure that the house of David continues on, continues to be there for Israel through the generations. Wouldn't this be the priority mission of the patriarch of the house of David? The more I think about this, the more sense it makes to me because of the things that we know from Scripture. And if it did fall to him to do that, could it be that his travels, his riches, and his faith were all by divine providence in order to put him into a position to advance the Lord's plan for the safety of the house of David and for the perpetuation of the house of David? I think that's an interesting thought that's not frivolous. What if the cup of the Lord's blood was really a symbol of the Davidic mandate of Yeshua's family to perpetually oversee his kingdom interests until his return? Maybe that's what it means that Joseph of Arimathea was the bearer of the Holy Grail, the holy bloodline, and was tasked with keeping that alive and well unto the final days. What if the secret of the Davidic family and the haven for the same was the real purpose of Joseph's settlement in England, with his merchant ships to rescue persecuted believers and family members from persecution, and a place for them to flee to? We've already seen that during this time period, England was beyond Rome's grasp, was not under Rome's authority. So wouldn't it be a perfect place for this mission? Especially since there's already a lot of Jews there. This would be the perfect place, really, to operate a mission of rescue for the house of David and for other believers. And if that was going on, would you expect anywhere in the so-called New Testament books to mention anything about it? Or to even mention any of these people again? Wouldn't that be a good explanation for why we don't hear from any of these prominent people again in Scripture? The thought crossed my mind that it could even explain why John said that Joseph was a secret disciple for fear. Because it could have been a misdirection, making people think that he was a coward, so he just ran away. Don't worry about him. Just look the other direction. It's possible. It's possible because when it was written in the 90s, there was great persecution. And as we know, John himself was persecuted and imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos, and many others were persecuted. So it's an interesting thought. It mentions a couple of times about waiting for the kingdom of God. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but this really could be coded language. It's in a couple of different places in these Gospels about Joseph, that he was waiting for the kingdom of God. And this could be coded language for believers who would understand it as meaning the house of David, waiting for the kingdom to be restored. So, again, a speculation, right? Between 55 BC and the 40s AD, the status quo between Rome and Britain basically changed. In other words, after that, after the 40s, it started to change. So during all this time was without direct military occupation. And so if it's true that during the 30s, they went there and they set up this oasis, really, in Avalon, they would have been able to do that unhindered by the Roman Empire. And basically, they would have it set up just about in time for the time when the Romans would become more aggressive in the 40s. Even then, it was a period of time before the Romans were actually able to conquer any of Britain. The British were a tough nut to crack for the Romans. I think part of the reason for that, people often think of the ancient British people as being tribal and therefore ignorant. And there's a lot of evidence that they were far from that they were very sophisticated. And the fact that they were able to withstand the Romans in the way that they did shows that they certainly were equal to that task. Eventually, Rome did conquer a lot of England, and they wanted it all. So they wanted all the British Isles, so they wanted to take Scotland. They continually tried from 71 AD until 211 AD. They kept trying to take Scotland, And the most they could ever do was less than half of Scotland. And then they couldn't hang on to it, and they finally had to give up. I just find that interesting. So I can easily picture how this could have happened if indeed what happened was that Joseph of Arimathea had established an outpost there for the persecuted believers and especially for the house of David who was fleeing. As the persecutions of the Romans finally did come and intensify, they would have kept moving further north until they finally ended up in Scotland, where the Romans could not succeed. And so that would eventually become the headquarters for a period of time for those people who were fleeing. And since Rome completely gave up in its efforts by 211, after that it would be completely free sailing in Scotland for any of those that were fleeing. And this is probably why there is a very strong tradition of people from the house of David fleeing to Scotland. So the facts of history seem to agree with a lot that we know about this. In the decline and fall of the Roman Church, Malachi Martin says, a meeting between Sylvester, the Pope, and the Jewish Christian leaders took place in 318. So this is well after all the Roman adventures in Britain were over. It is probable that Josie, the oldest of the Christian Jews, spoke on behalf of the Despacini and the rest. So this is interesting. There was a meeting actually between the Despacini leaders, and of course that means House of David leaders, with the Pope. They were trying to work things out. It goes on saying, that most hallowed name, Despacini, had been respected by all believers in the first century and half of Christian history. The word literally meant in Greek belonging to the Lord. It was reserved uniquely for Jesus' blood relatives. Every part of the ancient Jewish Christian church had always been governed by a Despasinos. This is shocking in the pages of a church historian, for them to admit that up to the middle of the 2nd century, all areas of the assembly, of course they're using their language, right, because they're Catholics, but up until the middle of the 2nd century, it was the family of Yeshua Messiah that were leaders in every area. That's what they're admitting. Quite amazing, I think. And it mentions there were at least 3 well-known and authentic lines of legitimate blood descent from Jesus' own family, he says. Here's something from Robert de Boron. I mentioned him earlier in his book, Joseph of Arimathea. And this is from Wikipedia. It says, in his verse romance, Joseph of Arimathea, composed between 1191 and 1202, Robert de Boron tells the story of Joseph of Arimathea acquiring the chalice of the Last Supper to collect Christ's blood. Joseph is thrown in prison where Christ visits him and explains the mysteries of the blessed cup. Joseph gathers his in-laws and other followers and travels to the west. He founds a dynasty of Grail keepers that eventually include Percival. Well, some of this I find very interesting. I find it interesting that he has a post-resurrection visit by Yeshua Messiah to Joseph of Arimathea, revealing to him the mysteries of the blessed cup. If something is a mystery, it's not what it seems, obviously, isn't it? And could this be the very occurrence where Yeshua gave Joseph of Arimathea this mission to protect the Davidic family line and set him on this course? It says it was in prison, so possibly just before they were set out to sea adrift. And so I think that's an interesting question. Going back to Malachi Martin, a question that comes to my mind is, did Joseph and the 12, I'm thinking these 12 are people that Joseph chose as leaders. Doesn't this make you think so? And did they pioneer a foothold in the British Isles for the protection of the Despacini and their brethren, protecting their secret unto the end of the age? You've heard what information I could pull together about this. You probably know that after this meeting of the leaders of the true disciples from the house of David with the Pope, in which, by the way, they demanded a return to Jerusalem. They demanded that the Greek bishops would all be deposed and the Despacini would once again be the ones in charge, and a number of other things that, of course, they were refused. And after this, basically what happened is, if they could, the Romans hunted them down to kill them, the house of David, because they were a threat. At that point in time, if you were one of them, where would you go? This is the 4th century. I would be on the next boat to Scotland. That's where I would be. They all knew about this. So the question, did Joseph and the 12 pioneer a foothold in the British Isles for the protection of the Despacini and their brethren, protecting that Davidic secret? And my conclusion is, if I were Joseph in his set of circumstances, that is exactly what I would want to do. Did he do it? You'll have to decide that for yourself. But it's certainly a very interesting discussion.
Was this video informative? Click the like button below to help spread the word to others. Feel free to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss out on more amazing content from Eliyahu Ben David.
Darwinian evolution. Junk science.
We say that Charles Darwin wrote a book, and it was published in 1859. And his book on the origin of species, which is really not the whole title, it's telling you what he's really saying. It was Darwinism that gave them scientific justification to go in and dominate the so-called savages. That's what evolution is about. Here's a newspaper article from Australia. The headline is, "Blacks Slain for Science's White Superiority Theory." Cross out white superiority theory and put Darwinism, because it's the same thing. Look at this map of Africa. See the little light green part? That's the only part of Africa that was not completely colonized by the Europeans. All the other colors you see on there, that's all areas of Africa that were divided up to the different European nations. Why were they there in Africa? To steal everything in Africa. That's why they were there. They were thieves. They were going into a place that did not belong to them, where they were stronger, where they were more powerful, and they were taking what they wanted. That's what they were doing. And they needed a moral justification for that in the eyes of the soldiers that they sent to die there to make them rich. And Darwinian evolution gave them the excuse they needed. It didn't just happen in Africa. Here in the United States, the indigenous people in America were virtually wiped out. And this too was justified by Darwinian evolution.
Often when racist history is cited, such as stories of slavery, colonialism, genocide of indigenous people, or Nazi atrocities, blame is directed towards the Bible and Bible-believing people. However, a closer look at actual documentation points to another culprit behind elitist racist atrocities. That culprit is Darwinian evolution. This obscured fact of history needs and deserves to be revealed. The film, Darwinian Evolution Junk Science, was made to set this record straight. See it today. See Darwinian Evolution Junk Science, www.truthpoint.info.